welcome to Voices of Wentworth. My name is Alia Armistead, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and by paying our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Voices of Wentworth was established over a year ago because a group of concerned citizens felt that the views of the majority in the electorate were not being reflected in federal policy. All of our previous events are available to watch via our website and YouTube channel. This session is also being recorded and will be available to watch as well. Nowhere is the disconnect between voters and policy clearer than in relation to climate. A recent ACF poll shows that 70% of voters in Wentworth believe the federal government needs to be doing more to address climate change. And 71% of voters say Labor and coalition plans for climate action will influence their vote. In particular, Wentworth residents are concerned about greenwashing, misleading statements being made by politicians about the effectiveness of their policies to reduce global warming. For corporations, there are laws prohibiting misleading and deceptive conduct that are keenly enforced by regulators such as ASIC and the ACCC. But in Australia, on the federal level, politicians are permitted to make whatever claims they wish about their policies, with the ballot box being the only recourse. One of the concerns about political greenwashing that is regularly raised within the Voices of Wentworth community is that some politicians say they will support net zero and reducing carbon emissions, but then their actions don't match their words. Our community engagement has shown that many in Wentworth who voted for our local representative, Dave Sharma, in 2019, were very pleased that he supports climate targets and climate action in theory. But they're now very concerned about his voting record on climate-related issues and that it has never deviated from the party line. Most recently, he has voted against allowing Parliament to debate Zali Steggall's climate change bills. He voted against permitting a motion to be put to allow the House to vote on whether to legislate net zero by 2050. He voted against a bill to cancel Petroleum Exploration Permit 11, known as PEP 11, which means there's still a risk of oil and gas exploration 5 kilometres from the coastline of Sydney. Further, in media engagements and on social media, Mr. Sharma mirrors the government statements about clean hydrogen, technology solutions and soil carbon when the effectiveness of such measures in terms of having a major effect on offsetting emissions from fossil fuels are unproven at best. This week, the Morrison government released its emissions reduction plan, which proposes a target of net zero by 2050 and relies on a range of technological innovations to achieve this. The document does not propose a reduction in fossil fuel extraction to achieve the goal. Many questions have been raised about the technology that will be relied on and the carbon and cost accounting that sit behind the plan. The purpose of today's discussion is to speak to experts to find out which policies and technologies really do what they say on the tin and which claims are just a tin full of greenwash. We'll also look at the ways that the media amplifies such claims. Our viewers come from across the political spectrum, so the questions we're putting to our experts are by no means aimed at just the conservative end. As we discovered in preparing for this session, accusations of greenwashing have also been aimed at those who support further climate action. So tonight, to examine the question of greenwashing in politics, we have Tim Buckley, Director of Energy Finance Studies for Australia and South Asia at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Tim has 25 years of financial markets experience, specialising in equity valuation, including as a top rated analyst and as a co-founder and managing director of ESG fund Arcix Investment. Alia Armistead is a climate and energy researcher at the Australian Institute. Alia has conducted research on climate emergency declarations, climate risk, negative emissions technologies, carbon capture and storage, and energy grid maintenance. Alia attended COP24 in Poland as a youth delegate with global voices and has presented on panels at the National Climate Emergency Summit and with the Young Australians in International Affairs. Jonathan Holmes was a television journalist for more than 40 years. After 12 years at the ABC, he was invited to Australia to become executive producer of the ABC's Four Corners. He's also been executive producer of Foreign Correspondent and the 7:30 Report, head of TV documentaries, and an ABC Washington correspondent, reported for Four Corners, making several programs about climate change and energy issues. Prior to the current presenter, he presented Media Watch on ABC TV. After hearing from each of our speakers, we'll go to some questions that we've received in advance from viewers. We'll also go to questions that you can type into the chat. So as you're listening to the speakers, as questions occur to you, put them in the chat function and we'll get through as many of those as we can. So to start off, I'll hand over to Tim Buckley to give us an overview of greenwashing from an energy and finance perspective, where we'll delve into the difference between green, clean, bio and blue hydrogen and learn which ones are greenwash. Welcome, Tim.
Good evening. Could I also start by paying my respects to the traditional owners, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation? So the scientific consensus is absolutely clear. The climate crisis is real. The calls for accelerated global action this decade are becoming more and more urgent with every year of inaction. I study the global financial markets response to the financial risks of climate change and also the corporate sector investment plans. And I'll start with maybe an unusual note that I've actually never been more optimistic about the increasingly aggressive global financial, corporate and policy response than I am today. The momentum internationally is huge and it's almost impossible to keep up with it. And I say that in full knowledge that anyone here at Australia is barraged with all of the negativities that we see in our domestic politics, as Delia touched on, and we'll further go into more detail. But let's start on the key point that there is a massive technology race underway globally, and nations around the world are positioning to get themselves in the best possible position for the industries of the future, the zero emissions industries of the future. And the investment magnitude is huge. We historically have talked a lot about the growing costs of inaction and the financial risks of stranded assets. But I think what's really pivoted the discussion in 2021 globally in the finance sector is the massive, unprecedented investment opportunities. And with that, also the corporate sector. I think the International Energy Agency's roadmap released in May 2021 was an absolutely pivotal point globally because it made very, very clear to everyone in the world what net zero emissions and 1.5 degrees means. I mean, there was no fudging of what 1.5 degrees means. It talks about the world cannot afford any new oil, gas or coal development globally with immediate effect. That's unusual historically for the IEA to be so blunt, and that to me was a pivotal point. The IEA now talks about the $4 trillion a year of investment that is needed over the next 10, 20, 30 years to actually deliver on that pledge, and that has got financial markets excited. This also combines with, to me, another key pivotal point in 2021, and that was the April 2021 announcement by the UN Financial Alliance for Net Zero Emissions by 2050 at the latest. That was a profound game changer, given the alliance, chaired by Mark Carney, is backed by $70 trillion of collective assets. Now, this financial alliance has actually grown really rapidly. In the last 3 months, in the 3 months to September, we saw 30% expansion to $90 trillion US dollars of assets under management by the groups pledging to 1.5 degrees by and net zero emissions by 2050. Probably far more importantly, also an interim 2030 target and annual transparency. And yet, having said that the September announcement of 90 trillion was profound, in the last month, that number has now risen to $100 trillion. We've seen the entire Japanese insurance sector commit to net zero emissions, 1.5 degrees, 2030 interim targets. We saw JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the world, $4 trillion of assets in their own right. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs this week. We saw the top 6 Canadian banks last week commit to net zero emissions and pledging to align with this Paris alignment. All of those companies historically have been the massive global fossil fuel financiers. Separately this month, we saw the Bank of China pledge to cease all new coal finance abroad. And the Bank of China is probably the largest investor in coal in the world outside of China. So that, to me, again, another profound announcement by one of the biggest banks in the world. And then India's federal bank this month alone, again, committed to a coal phase out. And that was the first Indian bank to do so. And India is my main market of focus. It's worth bearing in mind, India is the 3rd largest electricity market in the world. And what happens in India is going to be profoundly important for delivery on 1.5 degrees. And only this week, we heard from BlackRock's chairman, Larry Fink. IEEFA has done a lot of work with against and now more recently supporting what BlackRock's doing. It's been amazing watching Larry Fink go from being a climate laggard, a global climate laggard 3 years ago, someone who he said had no fiduciary duty to act on the science or the financial risks of climate change, as all his clients' problems. And now, every week, Larry Fink, the CEO, the chair of a company that manages $10 trillion, and just an unfathomable number. And he talks about, with provoking massive excitement, about the tsunami of asset reallocation that's underway. This week in the Middle East, he made a really unusual comment. He talked about how a claim that the next 1,000 unicorns will come from clean energy technology startups. Now, that was in reference to Tesla going through $1 trillion of market cap this week as they massively disrupt the global electric vehicle, automotive car markets. So global finance has radically shifted the goalposts in 2021. And to me, it would be really silly or profoundly dangerous to actually bet against a collective $100 trillion of financial institutions pledging to 1.5 degrees. And by the way, that's just to give some context, that's 5 times the size of the US economy. And whilst Delia is absolutely right, we need to talk and call out greenwash. It's interesting to me, the US Treasury's Financial Stability Oversight Council put out a really key new report that acknowledging that it is now working with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission of America, the most powerful regulator in the world, bar none. And they are going to ensure that the US financial system both addresses this key financial risk, but also provides key, consistent, full public disclosure on the risks, and that they will call out greenwashing because their job is to protect investors. So they're also calling for universal consistency in reporting, TCFD, the Task Force of Climate-Related Disclosures, adherence to that. And that means any Australian company that wants to access American capital, which is literally every major company in Australia, has to adhere to what the SEC and the US Treasury is now telling them. And I might just finish with 2 last examples that, again, make me very bullish. One in India, one in China. India's largest and most successful business group, it's not the one you probably have used to me talking about, the Adani Group, it's the Reliance Industries conglomerate. Reliance Industries recently committed to net zero emissions by 2035. Now, under the Paris Agreement, the common but differentiated responsibilities, the emphasis is on the developed world moving first and allowing time for the emerging markets to catch up and deliver a sustainable transition for their people. Now, I'll just remind you, Mukesh Ambani has committed, the founder of Reliance Industries has committed to a net zero emissions by 2035. He's also committed to spending $10 billion in the next 2 to 3 years. And just last week, he spent $1 billion in just 1 week on 4 separate transactions to buy some of the best, newest technologies in the world for deployment in India. So Mukesh Ambani has certainly thrown down the gauntlet to Andrew Forrest. And I just love the fact that he's effectively turning this into a race between the richest billionaires in India and the richest billionaires in Australia. Bring it on. And the final example, many climate science deniers point to the fact that it doesn't matter what Australia does. I mean, it's an absolute crap comment. We can come back to it, but they point to the fact that China isn't doing enough and it only matters what China does. It doesn't matter what we do. And it's an excuse for inaction. In my view, nothing could be further from the truth. China this week released a key policy document. It's called the N+1. It was endorsed by the Central Committee on the weekend, and it details the 37 key priorities of the Chinese government that explains exactly how China is going to deliver on peak emissions before 2030 and net zero emissions by 2060. It's all about the profound investments, technology, development and employment and export opportunities that China will gain from by embracing this massive disruption, technology-driven disruption, by being the world leader in industries of the future. I believe China already is that world leader, and that policy statement certainly outlines it in full. And it's a direct contrast to the slogan that our Prime Minister announced this week in lieu of a plan. But I think we can come back to that later. I'll stop here and happily take questions after our next 2 speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Well, that's certainly a source of hope for our listeners. It's good to know that we've reached a point where governments would be foolish to bet against the major corporates and their move out of fossil fuels. Perhaps we can take that message to those who set our energy policies. Next, Alia will address carbon accounting and offsets and many other climate issues that are sometimes difficult for the public to understand. Alia.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm coming to you from stolen Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we hear from the federal government pretty regularly and what is actually behind those statements and whether they are true and in what way they could be seen to be true or false. And Kath has got some slides for me, I believe. So if we can get them going, that would be great, but otherwise no worries. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So we'll start off with the one we hear all the time, which is meeting by cheating. So what have we actually achieved? Australia's emissions have reduced by about 20% since 2005. This is true, but why has it happened and where has it happened in the economy? So emissions reductions have not been distributed evenly across the economy, and they have been largely confined to the land use sector and agriculture. So LULUCF stands for land use change and forestry. Emissions declines have come from less land clearing, from drought, and from the impact of COVID-19, none of which are the result of federal policy. If we can go to the next slide, we can see that without land use change and agricultural emissions, Australia's emissions have actually increased by 7% since 2002. Emissions did decline pretty rapidly during the Rudd-Gillard years because of the carbon pricing scheme. If we could go to the next slide, we can see this red decline in the middle is when the carbon pricing scheme was in effect. And after it was repealed by the Abbott government, emissions did start to increase again. Addition to this, Australia has distorted its historical emissions since the Kyoto Protocol, which is the predecessor of the Paris Agreement, which is the main framework that emissions are now negotiated in the UN climate negotiations. So Australia included land use emissions in its 1990 baseline and lobbied hard for countries to have the ability to do this, with full awareness that land use emissions in 1990 were very high and fell rapidly in the years after that because of changes in land clearing regulations. And Australia used this as a buffer effectively so that they could increase emissions in other sectors while land use emissions were falling. And this treaty was negotiated in the years after 1990. So these changes had already happened, and it was strategic that these were included in the 1990 baseline. But in addition to that, Australia also negotiated to be one of the few developed countries that was actually allowed to increase its emissions in the first Kyoto Protocol period. So it was allowed to increase its emissions by 8%. And in the second Kyoto Protocol commitment period, it only negotiated a decrease of 0.5%. If we could go to the next slide, we can see how the inclusion of land use emissions in the 1990 baseline pretty drastically changes what Australia's emissions look like over time. So the figure on the left is with land use emissions included. You can see that they rapidly declined in the years after 1990, increased again, and have started to decline again. And the other figure is just without land use emissions included, and emissions have risen steadily over the years when you don't include land use. These figures are taken directly off the Australian government website, so you can access those yourself very, very easily. So how have we been meeting and beating our targets, and will we continue to do so? If Australia meets its 2030 target, it will be because it is an extremely weak target, and because state and territory policies have Australia on a path to overachieve the federal government's current target, which is 26 to 28% emissions reduction on 2005 levels. And state and territory analysis of state and territory policies shows that Australia is actually on a trajectory for potentially more than 40% emissions reduction on 2005 levels. And we can see in the long-term emissions reduction strategy or plan, so-called plan that came out in the last couple of days, that the federal government does predict that we will overachieve on that target. If we could go to the next slide. So this shows Australia's emissions in comparison to other countries when land use emissions have been excluded. Next slide again, please, Kath. So state and territory targets are effectively all more ambitious than the federal government's targets and policies. So if we meet and beat our weak 2030 target, it will be because it is weak, and it will be because state and territory policies allow us to do so. In addition, the Australian government has not renewed its 2030 commitments under the UN negotiations. It has resubmitted its old 2030 target, even though most of our allies and trading partners did increase the ambition of their 2030 target this year. And we can see that on the next slide. Australia's targets in comparison to some of our trading partners, with the old and the new targets lined up there next to each other. And next slide, please. So we are moving on to long-term targets. Is net zero by 2050 enough? Well, no, it's not for the best chance of a safe climate. If we go to the next slide, we can see that Australia will hit the world will hit 1.5 degrees of warming in the next couple of decades. So the rhetoric that we hear about net zero by 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees is a contradiction in of itself. Net zero by 2050 will not limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The remaining carbon budget, according to the IPCC, actually shows that if we want to have the best chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which the best chance is an 83% chance, according to the IPCC, then we only have 7 years roughly of emitting what we have been emitting up until the pandemic. So net zero by 2050 is not going to be very effective for that purpose. So why do we have a net zero by 2050 target then? And what does the long-term emissions reduction plan actually show? If we could go to the next slide, please. So amusingly, the net zero by 2050 target that the government has just announced is not quite a net zero by 2050 target, because they actually only predict that they will get 85% of the way there with current policies. And this plan has not announced any new policies at all. If we go to the next slide, please. We can see here they are predicting that national emissions will reduce by 80%, including a net. So net means that emissions that we emit are cancelled out by negative emissions in other sectors. Or we can do that by offsets. We can do that by things like soil carbon. We can do that by having negative land use emissions, so planting lots of trees and things like that. Although there is a big question mark over the degree to which we can do that. But effectively, any net zero target can just mean that we cancel out our emissions by doing other things. But even considering that, this plan doesn't actually get us to net zero emissions. It gets us to net 85% emissions with current policies, which is pretty ridiculous. So if we go to the next slide, please. We have this plan, but what does the Australian government actually plan on doing? So the rhetoric that we hear is that we'll use technology, not taxes, to meet our targets, and that our plan won't hurt industry and it won't hurt our economy. But no 2050 target is legitimate without a pathway to phase out fossil fuels or any commitment to ambitious short-term targets. And a brief inventory shows Australia's commitments for what they really are. So technology, not taxes, and our plan won't hurt our industry or our economy actually means expanding coal and gas. The Australian government has approved 3 new coal mines in the last month. There are 20 new coal mines proposed in New South Wales alone. Documents leaked last week reveal Australia's comments on the IPCC's Working Group 3 report that they are trying to remove language about the need to phase out fossil fuel power stations. The gas-fired recovery has prioritised extensive spending on gas, and the government plans on opening the Beetaloo Basin that could add 100 million tonnes of emissions into the atmosphere. And while much of that will be burnt overseas and so not necessarily count towards our profile, it will still be going into the atmosphere and therefore contributing to climate change. And the production and emissions in Australia is still equivalent to about 7% of our domestic emissions. We are allocating extensive climate funding to technologies like carbon capture and storage under the pretense that they will reduce emissions from fossil fuel industries. This is despite the fact that most carbon capture and storage globally is actually used for enhanced oil recovery. So for commercial carbon capture and storage facilities globally, there are 27 facilities, and 20 of those are actually used for enhanced oil recovery, which means that carbon CO2 is injected underground as a way of forcing up more oil from depleted oil fields. And in the process, they say that some CO2 does remain underground, but that doesn't account for the emissions that come from burning the increased oil that have come through that process. If we could go to the next slide, please. There is only one commercial carbon capture and storage facility in Australia, and that's the Gorgon project in Western Australia. And to date, it's only sequestered 1.7% of the project's total emissions, despite extensive funding and years of trying to reach its yearly targets. It's also the largest carbon capture and storage facility in the world. The Australian government has changed the remits of some of our institutions like the Australian Renewable Energy Agency to mean that it is now able to fund CCS. It is one of the priority technologies under the technology roadmap, which is the centerpiece of the long-term emissions reduction strategy. And CCS is now eligible for carbon credits, which means it can access the limited climate funding that there is under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And CCS gets another boost up by being included in clean hydrogen, which is not a color as we normally know, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen. Clean hydrogen is the government's own term for anything that it considers to be clean, and there is no benchmark for how low emissions have to be for hydrogen to be called clean, and it includes gas hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we often hear that Australia has one of the highest uptakes of renewables in the world, and we should all be very proud of ourselves for that. But Australia Institute research has showed that renewable uptake in Australia has basically been cancelled out by the government commissioning new gas plants, and that our energy transition has been one of the slowest in the world. And this is in comparison to other OECD countries. And the government does plan on pushing ahead with its proposed plan to pay coal and gas-fired power stations to stay open after they're no longer profitable as part of their energy security policy. Transport is one of the fastest growing sources of emissions in the Australian economy. It's currently worth about 17% of our national emissions, and we have no policies to address these emissions. We have no vehicle emission standards, and we have no federal plan to incentivise the uptake of electric vehicles. I believe that's the last slide. So all of these examples show that most of the rhetoric that we hear from the federal government is really just smoke and mirrors, greenwashing 101. So I might leave it there and we can take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Alia. I won't say that that filled me with as much hope as Tim's presentation, but it was informative. I'll now turn to Jonathan to talk about media and the way that it supports and enhances the greenwashing that we hear from our politicians, in particular what we've heard from News Corp for many decades, which has recently changed. Jonathan.
Yes, indeed it has. And I thought I would, in this little talk, just talk about that elephant in the room and leave other media greenwashing for any questions that come later. News Corp, its tabloid newspapers have lower readership than they used to have. And it's fashionable for some people to say, oh, look, you know, the Daily Telegraph no longer can determine how people vote in Western Sydney and so on. And to some extent, that's true. But the influence of News Corp is still enormous. Not just because of its newspaper monopolies in many cities and dominant position in Sydney and Melbourne, but because those newspapers have influenced, set the agenda for all the shock jocks, for the talk radio in all of those markets. And recently, of course, we've got the growth of Sky News, not just on Foxtel, but on digital media, on social media. It's huge on YouTube. It's huge, of course, in the United States on YouTube, and now free to air in most regional areas in Eastern Australia. And while that's been happening, in 2018, Sky, which used to be owned by 7/9 and B Sky B, the British company, which is 40% owned by News Corp, was taken over entirely by News Corp Australia, and that's seen and since then has driven down this path of climate denialism wall to wall after dark. So that influence, as we all know, has been used for 20 or 30 years, not for greenwashing, but for, if you like, blackwashing, for encouraging the notion that climate change is a hoax, or is massively exaggerated, or is hysterical lefties. It has made that notion respectable in Australia in a way that it really isn't anywhere else in the world, with the possible exception of the United States itself. And I don't think it's any coincidence, as Kevin Rudd says, that those are the two markets where the Murdoch media are most dominant. We all know, for example, that the Gillard climate price, and we saw how effective that was in the graphs that Alia showed us, was basically destroyed by Tony Abbott and the Murdoch media working in consort. And the Murdoch media News Corp has, I think, successfully made a climate price almost a political impossibility for either party for the foreseeable future in this country. And that's a great tragedy, because it's, I mean, everybody says, all the economists say that that is by far the best and most effective way of reducing emissions. So why have we suddenly had this transformation? And what does it mean? Is it Rupert? Is it Lachlan? Is it Michael Miller, the chairman of News Corp Australia? Is it all those individual editors suddenly deciding on their own that it's time to change tack? Well, obviously it's not the latter. All the talk that we hear from News Corp about our editors, you know, are independent and they make their own decisions and they go their own way. It's true of the smaller stories and the smaller directions, but I mean, overwhelmingly, if Rupert or the other powerful people at the head of News Corp decide that they want to go in one particular direction, that's where everybody goes. And we saw this, for example, incredibly clearly during the Gulf War, the months preceding the Gulf War, where every single organ that was owned by Rupert Murdoch anywhere in the world was urging war. So we see it again with climate change to a lesser degree. But we're not seeing this turnaround in the United States, for example. We're seeing it in Australia. Is it because, therefore, you know, Lachlan has had some kind of turnaround? Lachlan Murdoch is more conservative, he's very secretive. We know very little about him. He's technically only the executive, the non-executive chairman of News Corp. He's the executive chairman and CEO of Fox in the United States. And to give you what that means, he's paid a salary of $30 million US a year by Fox and a mere $5 million by News Corp. Nevertheless, Australia is Lachlan's turf, has been for 20 years. And most people that I talk to say that that is where I mean, Rupert has all the power if he wants to exercise it, but on the whole, he's delegated it to Lachlan. And I suspect this turnaround was definitely had Lachlan's say-so and permission to happen. What's driving it? In my view, two things. Obviously, the advertising, the big companies in Australia trying to put influence on the tabloids where their advertising still matters. They had some success, but I think this is all about the preservation of the Morrison government. What News Corp has done is give permission to Scott Morrison to accept the 2050 net zero target. It's made him the promise that it will not be attacking him for doing that, so long as he doesn't do anything too drastic to make sure that we get there. And for example, I mean, the front page of the Australian today is an absolute classic example of the way this operates. It's known as a drop. It's an exclusive story. You can see the word exclusive there by Simon Benson, who gets the vast majority of these stories from the government. And it's exclusively telling the Australian and nobody else that they were asked to limit methane emissions by, I think it was 30% by 2030 or whatever the date was, and that the Prime Minister has nobly refused to do any such thing in order to preserve agriculture, cattle farming, and gas. There's no real word of criticism in there. It's simply explaining what a noble decision this was. Now, that's the way that this alliance works. It will go on working that way. And there's another article in the Australian today by political correspondent Dennis Shanahan saying it's time for Labor to come up with its plan because it's going to have to be, to keep faith with their followers, it's going to have to be more drastic than anything Scott Morrison's proposing. And Scott will be able to show the Australian public that if you go Labor's way, it's going to be anti-Australian and destroy jobs and all the rest of it. So we can sort of see that strategy coming along for the next few months. So I'm afraid I'm very cynical about what News has done and what it's likely to do. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. My bet is that Lachlan is driving this. He's the one that promoted Paul Whitaker first to the Australian and then to Sky News. He's the one who's been driving Sky's foxification. Meanwhile, and we'll come to this, I think most of the media are doing a better job than they used to in looking at climate issues much more critically. I think the ABC is better than it used to be, although that's not saying an awful lot. I think the 9 newspapers are pretty good at times on this, and of course there's a whole host of lesser specialist articles that you can find quite easily on all of these topics. So I'm happy to talk about genuine greenwashing. I just thought I'd share my thoughts about News Corp first.
Thank you, Jonathan. One of the things that we're hoping to get out of this session is really to be able to equip our viewers to be able to spot greenwashing when they see it. And most of the time they're going to be spotting it in the media rather than reading Hansard. So it's really helpful to get an insight into what News Corp is likely to be doing in this space in the lead up to the election. Thank you. I just wanted to, we sometimes we get questions in advance of the town hall sessions. So I wanted to just throw to a few of those that haven't already been covered in the material. One of them relates to Barnaby Joyce, of course, who has championed the extension of the inland rail line so that more coal can be extracted and sent to port for export. He has stated that the rail extension is a carbon abatement program because trains have lower emissions than trucks on the road. No accounting at all for the coal that's in those trucks. Given that Australia is the world's second largest coal exporter, to what extent do the government's plans take into account fossil fuels that are being exported? I might throw that to Alia to start with.
Well, the Australian government generally doesn't like to draw any attention to the emissions that we export, and our fossil fuel emissions, fossil fuel exports, and the emissions embodied in those exports are more than double our domestic emissions. So the rhetoric that we're such a small percentage globally of emissions really doesn't take into account all the things that we do to perpetuate fossil fuel consumption overseas. We are very reliant on fossil fuel consumption overseas, although not as reliant as they would have us believe. So, I mean, we don't really know what the trade-off for the Nationals was in this long-term emissions reduction plan. And there is speculation that inland rail is an attempt to open up a lot of new coal basins, and the Australian government does forecast that we will increase our coal exports. So I think it's pretty obvious what their intention there is. It really speaks for itself. They have no intention of phasing out global coal consumption, and especially not our exports, even if we do have to transition our own domestic power. Thank you.
Another question that's come in. I'm concerned about politicians saying one thing and doing another. Labor's, this actually builds on something that Jonathan said. Labor is keeping pretty quiet about their climate policies. Are they still backing fossil fuels while pledging net zero? And I'll throw that to the panel generally if somebody can answer that. Do we know?
Labor will not walk away from gas at this stage, at least. It remains committed to expanding gas production, and it justifies that by saying that we need it in the short term, and they are not really willing to show their cards any more than that. So they do back gas.
You know, Labor is in this excruciating position and has been for what, at least a decade longer. And we all really understand it, that the inner city, the city electorates want to hear that they're going to do more on climate change, and their working class electorates in places like Hunter Valley and Queensland want to hear that they're going to do less. And we saw Bill Shorten at the last election campaign basically trying to say one thing in one constituency and another in the other, and not quite getting away with it. I don't think the position has improved, the political position for Anthony Albanese much, although, you know, possibly things have changed in Queensland a bit, possibly the mood is changing there, possibly the idea of Matt Kean's kind of push for the job opportunities that Tim was talking about of renewables and other such enterprises in the Hunter Valley might be getting through to people. But, you know, that's the Liberal Party. I don't know what Labor, I don't think Labor has solved the issue at all.
Thank you for that.
Delia,
Yes.
maybe just to build on that, as Alia mentioned, I mean, Australia is the largest exporter of liquid natural gas in the world, fossil gas. We're the largest exporter in the world. We're the largest exporter of coking coal in the world. We're the second largest exporter of thermal coal in the world. And cumulative, we are a top 3 global exporter. So just to reinforce the point Alia made, our exported emissions dwarf our domestic emissions, and any discussion of our domestic exposure and domestic commitment has to take into account the power of the fossil fuel industry and their enormously powerful lobbyists. So combining that with the brilliant description that Jonathan's given us all, reinforcing all of our fears about the power of the Murdoch media, is the power of the fossil fuel industry in Australia. And in some respects, thinking that Australia is going to be anything other than a laggard when we're a top 3 global exporter of fossil fuels is, whilst we have no donation reform, no advertising reform, and no truth in Parliament laws, as Zali Steggall has been pushing for, and no federal ICAC, and no ban on the revolving door from industry, namely fossil fuel industry, straight into the Prime Minister's office and straight back out again. Absent all of those reforms, the fossil fuel industry is going to absolutely hamstrung any politician other than an independent community-focused politician, because of the power of their lobbyists, the power of their donations, the power of their advertising. And so to some degree, as Jonathan said, I think Labor is absolutely hamstrung by that. And certainly my discussions with Labor is that they are very, very aware of the enormous investment, employment, and export opportunities. The economics of this are becoming so blindingly obvious. They're willing to talk about it, but anytime they do, it just gets absolutely skewed badly by the Murdoch media and the lobbyists combined. And so they just keep it to a very small target. It's an impossible situation. We need huge reform of our democracy to protect it, in my view.
Thank you for that, Tim. And building on that, another question is, if we've got Australia as a massive exporter of fossil fuels, international markets and countries are moving away from fossil fuels, the government's own plan in its projections suggests that that push from international markets will mean that emissions will go down. But at the same time, they've said that regions that are dependent on fossil fuel mining won't suffer. How do we reconcile those statements? How can that all be true?
Alia, do you want to go first? Or I'm happy to respond.
You can go first if you like, and I'll...
The reality is that very, very heavily coal mining dependent communities are going to be exposed. But this is where the media hype, the spin by enormously powerful lobbyists who underpin $100 billion a year of exports, mainly by companies that pay absolutely zero tax. So their requirement to protect their $100 billion a year golden goose means that they spend billions of dollars undermining our democracy. So we need to put in perspective, the world is going to change. It's not going to be whether we choose to export coal or not. It's up to Japan, Korea, and China to decide whether they still want our coal. And they've made it very, very clear that this decade they're going to do drastic action to diminish their reliance on coal, LNG, and oil. And so it is going to happen regardless. So we can just leave those communities high and dry with no transition plan. The reality is when you go out and talk to the people in those communities, they're fully aware of the global trends. They just don't want to wear a disproportionate share of the consequences. So I think we need to talk up the investment opportunities. And so much as I'm not a huge fan of Twiggy Forrest in most of his endeavours, I will call him out. His announcement last week was brilliant. The Gladstone 2 gigawatt electrolyser manufacturing facility is brilliant. It will involve thousands of construction jobs. It will involve hundreds of high value added manufacturing jobs in a key region that's dependent on coking coal for steel production. So we need more of those sort of investments. We need Yara of Norway to build their $1 billion ammonia facility over in the Western Australian market that they've already announced, which they're already building, and they need to accelerate those plans. Twiggy Forrest also announced he was building a green ammonia facility at Gibson Island in Brisbane last week as well. Now, that is the first green ammonia plant of size in the world. It's going to transform the world's industry. Australia is one of the biggest users of ammonium nitrate for both explosives for our coal and mining industries, but also for fertilizers. We import most of our ammonia. Twiggy's proposing to build an ammonia facility using our wind and solar resources, the best resources in the world, the lowest cost resources in the world, to build green ammonia in Australia rather than importing fossil ammonia from Canada. So we need people to actually invest hard dollars in industries of the future that actually demonstrate on the ground real jobs, real investments, real exports, and that shows the path to the future so that we stop this protection racket for 20,000 coal mining workers jobs that we're going to lose anyway. No one ever seems to, or sorry, no federal government minister ever talks about the 40,000 brilliant university employees that they've managed to sack in the last year. That was far more value added. Australia's biggest value add, export value add, is in fact education for Chinese and Indian and foreign students. Yet we've thrown that, sorry, our federal government threw that on the scrap heap, and they just want to protect the 20,000 important coal miners, but they ignore the other 10 million workers in Australia. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you.
It's certainly worth pondering how much the Liberal Party and the National Party get from universities in terms of donations. You find it's very small.
I'll just add on to that as well, onto Tim's point that the world will change, and it will, and it is changing, but it also isn't going to change tomorrow. So the short term is for energy transition is still longer than most election cycles, and no politician wants to be the one to break that news or make that hard decision, which is why Labor is also not willing to do it at the moment. So it is going to happen, but when will the Australian government bite the bullet, or which Australian government will? And we can tell that the world is changing because I'm no financial analyst, but Tim can probably attest to the fact that financial institutions are increasingly unwilling to back new fossil fuel developments. And so the government is increasingly going to underwrite them, and it is trying to do that. But I'll just add on to the fact that other countries are going to be much less willing to import our dirty exports and have them basically negate what they're trying to do domestically. And that's where carbon border adjustment mechanisms are going to start coming into play, where the EU has already put on the table the first carbon border adjustment mechanism, and other countries are increasingly going to look to do that. And that will put Australia's emissions intensive exports on the line because other countries are going to be taxing them. So if we don't transition our own industries and our exports to cleaner alternatives, other countries are going to try and force us to do it.
So it sounds like any reduction in emissions by Australia is going to be forced by overseas countries and companies and by our own billionaires stepping in rather than anything to do with federal policy. I realise that time is marching on, and I'm going to throw to Kath to see if she can pick out some questions from the chat.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, did Jonathan, did you just have something you wanted to say then? Was that you or Tim?
Yes, thanks, Kath. I just wanted to pick up on the point Alia made, and it's absolutely a brilliant key point. So I'll just reinforce it, if I may. When we hear from our federal politicians, they always talk about how the electricity system wouldn't work if we turned off coal use overnight. I mean, it's such a moronically stupid comment. No one is talking about turning off every power plant in Australia overnight, nor are we talking about stopping coal exports tomorrow. Now, we should have stopped them a decade ago, but the reality is we are the #1 supplier of coking coal for steel in the world. We supply 55% of the world's coking coal, and in a decade's time, we will still supply probably 55% of the world's coking coal needs. They will be smaller, but we're talking about a 2-decade transition. And don't take my word for it, the New South Wales Treasury, which last time I checked was a Liberal national government, just put out a policy statement for New South Wales saying they expect coal mining employment in New South Wales to decline by up to 100% within the next 20 years. So this is a 20-year transition. And as Alia said, the problem is we have a myopically short federal election cycle of 2.5 to 3 years, and we should hold politicians to account for the long term, not the short term.
Let's think. So the question, I'll go through as many of these as we can get through. The first question sort of follows on a little bit from that with the way the government frames its messaging, looking at 2030 targets. So the question is, what's the best counter to this slogan, we're going to meet and beat our emissions targets? I think they're talking about the 2030 targets, which, as Alia explained, are quite weak. And Angus Taylor is constantly telling everybody on the news every chance he gets that we're going to meet and beat our targets. But that doesn't take into account the fact that those targets are not in alignment with what's needed under the Paris Agreement, or as recently highlighted by the IPCC report. So how do we get the media to put more pressure on federal government ministers on this point, to get them to be focusing more on what the IPCC report is asking for?
I think the easiest response to that is that anyone can meet a target if it's a weak target and you give yourself a head start in the race, which is exactly what the Australian government has done. So align with our allies, align with our trading partners, have a better target and meet and beat that target because it's inadequate.
Yeah, and I think Alia also said in a formal presentation, a point which I'll just again reinforce, claiming credit for all of the brilliant work of our state governments when in fact the federal government's done everything they can to undermine that brilliant action is just false. We need truth in Parliament, right, for our energy minister to claim the merits or the kudos for the brilliant work of Lily D'Ambrosi down in Victoria or Matt Keane in New South Wales or South Australia or Queensland is just wrong.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does the fact that the government is trying to change the rules so that carbon capture and storage research can count as approved offsets mean that it's counted more than once in the government's plan? I'm not sure I understand that question, but someone with more knowledge of the plan might be able to answer that.
So the plan doesn't actually show how that will be counted, but we know that there is integrity issues with the way that Australian carbon credit units are allocated and measured. So I can't say that the answer is yes, but I can say that there is definitely concerns that there will be issues of double counting and integrity issues with the way that credits are allocated. Just to go back to the point of even crediting carbon capture and storage in the first place, we are allocating climate funding to the fossil fuel industry by giving credits for carbon capture and storage. I mean, almost all of that carbon capture and storage is intending to happen for gas processing in Australia. So all that we're doing is enabling that to expand and giving climate funding to the gas industry to produce more gas.
All of these big, attempts to capture and store carbon from coal-fired power stations, whether they're tack-on or whether they're brand new, have been dismal failures. It just hasn't happened anywhere in the world that I know of. And I remember interviewing John Howard back in 2007, and saying, look, even if you succeed, surely, Prime Minister, it's going to be far more expensive than current electricity. Oh no, he said, I don't see why that should be the case. We'll have to wait and see. So it's this extraordinary kind of myth that the fossil fuel companies have been able to maintain for, what is it now, 20 years, that this is going to be the miracle cure. And there's no evidence whatsoever that it is. It's amazing.
About a year ago, we had a session, a town hall special event where we talked to Marion Wilkinson about her book, The Carbon Club. Yeah. And something that Tim was saying earlier reminded me of this, and that you were saying about the Murdoch press, and this whole the climate denialism sort of agenda that has been run by the Murdoch press in the US and here for some time. And the obvious question is, why would they run that agenda? Like, why does it benefit them to do that? And it occurs to me that, again, that it comes, and you've got, you said Lachlan Murdoch wants to preserve the Morrison government here, and that's why he's now changing tack, and why the Murdoch press is changing tack. And just these links between these extremely wealthy media owners and the fossil fuel industry and the people in power, and all of this stuff going on behind the scenes, and these agendas that are running there, and the way that the government essentially has been captured by these very wealthy interests is really the only way that I can understand that what's happened over the last 20 years and why there is so much focus on, for example, carbon capture and storage, which we know doesn't work, but they keep on talking about it anyway.
I'll just say briefly, a lot of his numerous biographers have tried to track ways in which Rupert Murdoch directly profits from mining or other kinds of industries that are directly threatened by good climate change policy, and they haven't really been able to find any. I don't actually think that Murdoch's climate change denialism comes from the profit motive so much as an ideological conviction. He's always been an extremely, well, not always, but since about 1972, he's been extremely conservative politically, but he's also got this brilliant eye for how you sell conservatism to the working man. I mean, that's how he made his fortune at The Sun in England. It's how he's made his fortune, vast fortune, with Fox in the United States. And he's able to package stuff, or his people are, and the people that he hires are able to package up stuff that isn't actually for the benefit of working people, to persuade them that it is. It's one of the ways that he's a genius. And but I think at the bottom, in the Murdoch's case, so there's a celebrated story that Chris Mitchell tells in his autobiography of one of these big News Corp assemblies where they bring people in from all over the world. I think it was in Aspen. And James had persuaded Al Gore to come and give his presentation, Inconvenient Truth presentation, to the assembled editors at News Corp. And Andrew Bolt, at the end of it, got stuck into Al Gore, as you would expect, in a very ferocious way. And Chris Mitchell describes seeing Lachlan Murdoch sitting there, grinning all over his face and almost cheering. He was so thrilled to see Andrew really go for Gore. Now, that doesn't say anything much. It's just an anecdote. But, I think there's a conviction there in those two cases.
I'm just mindful of the time. We are over the hour. So I'll finish up with one question, which is not a comedy question. It is real. Does feeding kelp to cows mean they produce less methane? It's probably one for Alia.
There is research to show that that is the case, yes. It's a new technology. I don't believe it's being deployed on any sort of widespread commercial scale. I think it's still in the sort of pilot development phase and it has a patent by the CSIRO. But I don't think we should pin our hopes on that technology. I don't know in the grand scheme of things how much it will actually be able to reduce emissions.
Thank you.
So yes, but no silver bullet.
Thank you. We don't want silver bullets and cows getting mixed up. Thank you all for your time, both our viewers and for our excellent speakers. That has been amazing. And thank you for the work that you're putting into this space. I know that our speakers are very busy engaging with the public on this topic at the moment, since it is the topic of the day. To everyone watching, we hope that this has been an engaging session and will assist you in talking confidently with your friends, neighbours and colleagues about some of the technology and policies that have been raised today and why greenwashing in politics will be such an important issue at the next federal election. Please don't forget to complete our Voices of Wentworth survey, which I'm hoping Kath will now plug into the chat. If you're a Wentworth voter, share it with your friends. We collect information from the Wentworth electorate in a number of ways. That's one of them. We also host Voices from the Couch sessions. We haven't yet gone into the live public space because we know that some people are still concerned about COVID, so we're still online. We've got another Voices on the Couch next Wednesday on the 3rd of November. You can check out our website to find out how to join that and to tell us what you're concerned about, what you care about in Wentworth. Also on Saturday, we've restarted our democracy walks, so please come along and where you can meet some of our Voices of Wentworth volunteers and tell us what you care about and what you think of this session. So thank you very much for everybody coming along tonight. That's been fantastic, and good night.
Authorised by D. Burridge, Bondi Junction.